Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all out tonight. We're quite excited about this new series we're going to be starting into, walking through the Bible. And we're just going to be exploring what the Bible has to teach. I haven't preached twice or taught twice on a Sunday for a wee while. So it's quite nice because you can remember to do the things that you forgot to do in the morning. You can do at night. And I forgot to, it was actually last Sunday, I meant to tell the joke that won the Fringe joke of the year. Have you all heard it? Well, you are about to hear it, so don't spoil the punchline. It goes like this. I used to think my boyfriend was a zookeeper until I found out he was a cheetah. Okay, that joke won the... Anyway, it's not necessarily the content, it's the way you communicate it. And that's very pertinent to, I was desperately searching for a link, very pertinent to the Gospels. And so if you've got your Bibles, let's turn to the index and look at the index. And the first thing that should strike you, we talk about the Bible, and we use it singular. But in fact, the Bible is not a singular, it's a plural. The original word was biblos, and it means many books. And so what we have here is many books, and we have a library of books. We have 39 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New Testament. And if you begin to look at the kind of literature, you'll discover they're all very different. And there's a whole variety. There are letters. The ones in the New Testament are predominantly letters. There are some sermons. There are some songs. There are some proverbs. There's history books. There's prophetic books. There's a whole collection of different kinds of books. And these were written and designed that we read them book by book. Might shock you, we get so dependent on them, but chapter and verses weren't part of the original letters or books or gospels. They were added subsequently, and we've kind of got ourselves addicted to that way of reading the Bible. Some people call it the medicinal method of Bible reading, which is like 10 verses a day keeps the doctor away. And you do like 10 verses, oh, I've done it. But actually, they weren't designed to be read like that. The Gospels were designed to be read at a single sitting. You came along and you listened to them. A few years back, there was somebody who hired a West End theatre in London, and they just read Mark's Gospel, and they were selling out. People just going to listen to Mark's Gospel and its story being told. And that's how they were designed to be heard and engaged with. And so it's good every so often to remind ourselves of that and to understand that when we come to verses and texts, that these were set in books that were designed to be read as books. As you look at your index, you'll notice that right at the start of the New Testament, we have 4 distinctive books called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these are often described as 4 ancient biographies of Jesus. Although immediately when we start to say they're biographies, this gives us a problem. They do contain lots of stories about Jesus' life and death, but they're not really biographies. Even by ancient standards, they're not really biographies because of their preoccupation with one specific aspect of Jesus' life. Do you know what that is? It's his last week or his death. And if you look at the stories, you'll discover that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, more than a third of the gospel is preoccupied with Jesus' death. So it's not really a biography or far less an autobiography of Jesus. It's preoccupied with Jesus' death. When you get to John, John really goes overboard, and he spends 50% of his gospel preoccupied with the last week of Jesus' life. And so there's this preoccupation with Jesus' death, which kind of skews it as a traditional or a traditional form of ancient biography. But the other thing about it is it's described as good news. And we have this word, gospel, to describe this distinctive type of literature. You see, really before Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, we didn't really have anything that would conform to what we call gospels. And we need to think a little bit about this word and what it means. We get it from the Anglo-Saxon, Godspell, which means God's good news. And it's lifted from a biblical context where it was the word, a Greek word, evangelon, which means evangelist. We get evangelist from that. And it meant one who proclaims good news. And of course, immediately that raises the question, what was the good news? What's this gospel that was proclaimed? And in the Greek context that the word was lifted from, the word was used when there was a battle going on. And at the end of the battle, someone hopefully won. And if your side won, usually what would happen is they would hire runners, marathon runners, and they would run. And they would run from the site of the battle, and they would run from one city to the next city to the next city, and they would go in and go, "We've won!" Yay! And that was the good news. That was the gospel. You'll see Isaiah uses it actually exactly in that way. It is the good news that is being proclaimed on the mountains, the victory of God. And so by choosing this word gospel to describe this literature, they're saying it's something about the victory of God. And it's a proclamation of God's victory. Mark starts his gospel like this. Let's go. Next slide. He says, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And sometimes people argue about the Greek, but it says, this is the gospel that Jesus brings. This is the news of victory that Jesus is about. And so what's happening in these stories is they're not just accounts of Jesus' life. They're telling us about the significance of what Jesus did. And it's very focused in terms of what it's trying to communicate to you. Now you'll notice as you study the Gospels that sometimes details are slightly different in the Gospels. And that isn't because they were making things up. They weren't making things up. But what they wanted to do was, for the audiences that they were speaking to, they were trying to make sure that people understood the underlying meaning of what happened, of its significance. You see this in the genealogies that you find in Luke and Matthew. In Matthew's gospel, you have, in Luke's gospel, you have a genealogy that's set out in sevens. And the people that are being listed in it aren't folks that didn't exist. They were real people, but the reason he's setting them out in sevens is to communicate that this is the fulfillment of the work of God. And so he's setting out to get so that you have a sense of the underlying meaning of what was happening. And so the good news of the Gospels is bringing this message of the significance of what happened with Jesus. And they want to convey that. And sometimes they didn't follow a chronology. They changed details. They moved details around to communicate that underlying message. The closest thing we have to it is Acts chapter 10. You'll see a sermon of Peter. We call the early preaching kerygma. And you'll see that Peter preaches the good news. And the good news is Jesus has appeared in Galilee. He came. He healed people. He then came to Jerusalem, he died on a cross, and on the third day he rose again, and now you can know forgiveness of sins. And you'll see that's the sermon. And if you look at Mark's gospel, that's basically exactly what he lays out. He's trying to communicate the significance of who he is. But also by using the word gospel and talking of gospels, they're trying to connect what's found in these books with the bigger story of the Bible, because they're trying to say, to understand the victory that Christ has brought about, to understand what Christ has done, you need to understand the bigger picture of the Bible as a whole. And folks have looked at the teachings of the Old Testament, and you'll discover that Genesis 1 through 11 has a pattern, and then Genesis 12 through to the end of the book of Kings has a pattern. And this is basically how the story goes. God creates the world is good. He creates humanity as custodians and guardians of that world. Those human beings rebel. Rebellion leads to a world of violence and death, and that then brings them to captivity. Genesis 11, they're in Babylon in captivity. God doesn't give up on the process, and Genesis chapter 12, the whole thing restarts again. And it starts with Abraham and his family. And you have Abraham and his family, and then you have Moses, who brings the people back to a garden land, Canaan. And he seeks to lead them into a place where they will bless all the nations through the land of Israel, or through the people of Israel. But what happens? As they appoint kings, they end up rebelling. It leads to a world of violence and death, and they all end up in captivity. You know where? Babylon. It's a cycle. And so the next part is that these prophets arise and say, there's been a basic problem with this cycle. And it's got to change. And they began to talk about what was the problem. What do you think the fundamental problem was that the prophet said? This is good fun. It's more interactive. What was the fundamental problem? Why did it keep going wrong? Sorry? Rebellion, yep. Running away from God, yep. Disobedience, yes. And other things, anything else on that? Sorry? Worshipping idols, idolatry. So all of the things that we were describing, violence, disobedience, all of that, you'll see that the prophets say this is because you have put something else in God's place. And you have given yourself over to idolatry. And when you give yourself over to idolatry, you move out from a place of God's blessing to a place where God will curse you. And as you move out into that place, then this is when all these nations invade you and all these terrible things happen and everything, because you are idolatrous. And if you want that to stop, and this is what the prophet said, they said, you have to sort out the worship of God. You have to give up on the idolatry and give God the place that he deserves. And they said, more than this, they said, you know what? God is going to send someone who is going to reestablish the true worship of God. And again, in the Old Testament, they thought of this in terms of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple. So they thought the true worship of God will happen when we go back to Jerusalem, we rebuild the temple, and then we will have the true worship of God happening again. And then what will happen is God will bless us, and we'll go on to be the most powerful nation in the world, and we'll go on to rule the world. And that won't be a bad thing for the world, because it won't be an oppressive thing, because it will bring in a reign of justice and peace for all nations and all creation. And they called that the kingdom of God, or the reign of God. So and they called this figure, it was a high priest king. So a high priest king was going to come. He was known as the Messiah, and he was going to restore the true worship of God, and that was going to lead to the reign of God filling the earth. And so the reason it's high priest king is that the Messiah had two functions. First of all, he had a religious function of restoring the true worship of God to the people, because you've got to get that right. Because if we've got the idolatry problem, we're still under God's curse. We start to worship God in the way we are called to worship him. We move from curse to blessing. The blessing of God falls on us, and then good things start to happen. And eventually the reign of God, so the kingly office, spreads throughout all the world. That was the preparation that was there in the Old Testament. The gospel tells you the king has come. And you'll notice it talks about the kingdom of God. So that's what it's talking about. It's talking about the reign of God that is being brought about through the Messiah. But it's not a political reign. It's a reign that's brought about by putting people right spiritually And out of that comes all the consequences in terms of the reign of God and the outworking of that socially, and actually in the whole of creation, the prophet saw us. And so the gospel says, this one has come. And so there's a declaration there that's being made. However, the problem you immediately confronts you in Mark, as you start to think about this gospel, is how did it work out? How did the story that Mark is about to tell us work out? Because the way they sort of thought it would go is this high priest king is born. He brings back, restores the true worship of God. A lot of people thought the temple worship, although it was going on at the time of Jesus, they thought it was corrupt. And they thought the new prophet would come, this Messiah would come, and he would get rid of all the corruption out of the temple. And then, once he'd got rid of all the corruption from the temple, he would then destroy the enemies of Israel, which at that time were the Romans. So the way it was going to go was a religious leader was going to come, he was going to restore the true worship of God, and then you were going to see all the enemies of Israel being vanquished as the reign of God went to reach the ends of the earth. Now that looks just like Mark's gospel, doesn't it? Does it? No, I'm glad you know that. It's not what Mark does. Mark does something absolutely shocking. He says the reign of God comes through a crucified Jew. The reign of God comes not through a victorious political leader, but through a person whose life looks an abject failure. A person who dies at the hands of the Roman oppressors, whose mission ostentatiously seems to have completely failed. How can that be? And Mark says this, and this is one of the key verses in Mark's gospel. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. Now, the first thing is, wait a minute. This isn't our imagery of kings. You know, a king doesn't come to serve, he comes to rule. And Mark says, no, the king expressed his reign through service. And then he says this, and he gave his life as a ransom for many. The analogy there that he's using, he's lifting from the Roman world. And he's talking about setting slaves free. If you were going to set slaves free, you paid a ransom, and that released the slave. And what he's saying is, this is how the Messiah freed you, through his death. And this brought about this new reign of God. And folks are going, really? And Mark's saying, yes, through the death of Christ, we see a movement. We move towards freedom, and we go from darkness, a place of bondage, to a place of light and freedom. From a place of death to a place of life. From a place of guilt to a place of forgiveness. And it all comes through the death of the Messiah. Not some amazing victory that ends up with the political domination of the entire world. And Mark says this is the good news. Now, we kind of are used to this story. But if you were a first century audience anticipating what the Old Testament had promised, you would find this shocking, if not absurd. And we're going to actually see that the different audiences that the Gospels were written to were responding in different ways to this idea. So this raises the question, why do we have 4 Gospels? Any ideas? Why 4? Yeah, good answer. We had an early church father called Irenaeus, and he said, yes, since there are 4 corners of the world, we needed 4 Gospels to go to all those corners. But 4 different communities, yeah. So the reason we have 4 different Gospels is really 2 reasons. First of all, because they were addressing different audiences, and that message that I've just described had to be communicated to different people in different ways, because they had different questions about it. And we'll see how it does that to those different audiences. But it also brings different perspectives. You see, Jesus' life and death was such that one perspective wasn't going to be enough. And they wanted to bring different perspectives so we could understand the multidimensional nature of the wonder of what happened. And so we find ourselves with these 4 Gospels. Let's look at, for a moment, at the different audiences and who were the audiences that they wrote to. First of all, we have 2 Gospels that deal with non-Christians and 2 Gospels that deal with Christians. I know you can see it all in my notes, but just for guess, non-Christians, which one do you think were written to the non-Christians? Yeah, good. Glad you can all read. And one's to Christians. Good, Anthony. And one's to Christians. Matthew and John. How do we know that these are written? Well, things like John's Gospel actually tells us. But these are written so that you may continue to believe. And so the idea is they're already believers. And so John is writing this to continue to encourage them in their faith. So John is making it really clear. We can work out the other answers why they're non-Christians or Christians by the nature of the way that the stories are told. For instance, in Matthew's Gospel, the lost sheep, the story of the lost sheep, is about a backslidden Christian coming back to Christ. In Luke, it's about a non-believer discovering salvation. And so it's like, okay, same story. Why have they told it slightly differently? It's to the different audiences that they're writing to. And lots of people spend lots of time kind of studying these things. Let's think a little bit about these distinctive audiences. Let's think a little bit about the non-Christian audiences that we're into, and let's think about the Christian audience. So I'm going to start with Mark's Gospel because we think that was the first Gospel that was ever written. And the first thing about Mark's Gospel that should really shock us is that we think it's the first Gospel, yet it is the least Jewish of the Gospels. Okay? And this is like, hang on, surely the first Gospel would be closest to Judaism, not furthest away from it. And that's a bit of a dilemma. So what's going on there? You'll notice that Mark has to explain what happens at the temple. Mark chapter 7. He has to go through why Jews wash. And you're thinking, well, where is there an audience that doesn't know why Jews wash and have ceremonial purity? But what's going on there? He has to explain Aramaic words because the audience don't speak Aramaic. So Mark knows Aramaic, but the audience don't. So who don't know Aramaic words? And then the other thing that's very interesting is that it's full of lots and lots of Roman military terms, very distinctive, specific terms. One of the interesting ones is that the Jews had 3 watches of the night. So they divided the night into 3. But the Romans divided the nights into 4. How many watches do you get in Mark's Gospel? 4. So it tells us he's using a Roman method of calculating the watches of the night. The other thing that's really interesting about Mark's Gospel is, you know, when it says the rooster will crow. Okay, now people think that's a chicken. Okay, how many of you, let's confess, how many of us thought that was a chicken? All right, it's not. It's the 3rd watch of the night. And what happened was, in a Roman fort, was on the 3rd watch of the night, they took out a big trumpet to wake up the next watch, and they blew it. and they sounded it twice. And when they sounded it, it denoted the changing of the guard. So it was called when the rooster crows. Okay? Now, if you read the Gospels, it's really interesting. Mark's Gospel, he knows what it means. See, when Luke and Matthew start to write about it, they're not sure if it's a chicken or not. And it's like, oh, these guys knew. And what's also really interesting about Mark, and we'll talk more, and I love Mark's Gospel, as you probably can tell, is that, you know, if you look at the way the story builds to this apex. And do you know what the apex of the story is? Do any of you know? Happens at the foot of the cross. Centurion. Yeah. Did anybody see The Greatest Story Ever Told? It was a movie, and they got John Wayne to play the centurion just for like 30 seconds at the foot of the cross. It's the best moment ever. I might try and get it for next week. And John Wayne goes, "Surely this was the Son of God." And it's great. It's just a wonderful moment in cinematic history. Anyway, but it's also the point at which Mark's gospel builds. And you just think about this, right? Remember, Romans are hated by the Jews. And the apex of the story of Mark's gospel is a Roman centurion sitting at the bottom of this cross, realizing that this is the crucified God who has died for him. Now, I think, just throw it out there, that we can be relatively confident. It's been written to Romans, Gentiles who didn't know what it was to be a Jew, and maybe, in fact, I think it's more than a maybe military. That actually the first gospel was written. Remember Cornelius in Acts 10, a soldier getting converted. Maybe somebody like Cornelius was saying, you know what, I want my men to know about this Jesus. Hey, Mark, would you write a gospel that I can share so that my men, Gentile soldiers, that they will know this Jesus. And of course, the first thing they were going to ask was, how can a crucified Jew who died at the hands of the Romans be the Messiah? And Mark deals with that. Matthew's gospel deals with the Jews, and he addresses a Jewish audience. How do we know? There are all kinds of ways that we know this, but a couple of simple things. One of the things is, in Judaism, they didn't like to use the word God. If you ever read the Jewish Chronicle, you'll see that they have, the word God never appears. You get a capital G, a dash, and a D. And if you ever ask, sometimes when I go to Israel, I ask some of the Jews, how do you say Yahweh? And they'll refuse. They'll never tell me how they think you should say it, because you should never say the name of God in case you blaspheme. And so they never say the name of God. And if you look at Matthew's gospel, he doesn't talk about the kingdom of God. What does it talk about? Heaven. Yeah, he doesn't use God. He uses heaven. And this is telling us that this is definitely written for a Jewish audience where they're uncomfortable about using the name of God. We also see an incredible series of Old Testament references. There are more than 29 of them, direct quotations. And indirect quotations are everywhere in Matthew. It's great fun. You can identify what's that an allusion to? At least 121, maybe more. And so Matthew is the most connected gospel to the Old Testament. That's why it probably appears first in the New Testament. Is it kind of gives us the best bridge from the Old Testament into the New Testament. So here we have Matthew writing for a Jewish audience. Again, writing the story and trying to explain, how can this crucified Jew be the promised Messiah of the prophets? How can that be? And Matthew argues and says, you know what? It was there all the time in the Old Testament. You just missed it. You just missed it. You need to go back and reread the Old Testament, and you will see it's there. The suffering servant of Isaiah is there. And so that's kind of where Matthew is coming from. Next slide. Next one is Luke Acts. Well, again, we actually are told who he's writing for. He addresses a man called Theophilus. And he says, I'm writing this for you, Theophilus. We don't know anything really about Theophilus, other than I think he was searching and wanting to find out about Christianity. And what Luke does is, to this non-Christian, he's trying to explain, do you know what? Christianity turns everything upside down. He's saying the fact that we worship a crucified Jew radically reorientates all of our values. And suddenly, what you think is power is not power. What you think is marginal is at the center. That this age that the Christ has introduced has turned all our values on the top of themselves, because we worship a crucified Jew, and the cross says no to all the values that you hold. And so Luke's gospel it's socially militant. It's radical. It's kind of out there. If you were Jeremy Corbyn, you would love it. So Luke's trying to explain to this guy, an outsider, who's saying, so what's it all about? Just explain it to me. And he's basically saying it turns the world upside down. That's what Jesus does. Then John's gospel is probably written with the widest audience. John is thought to be the last gospel written. And it probably was written as a universal gospel for all the Christians and what the Christians were facing, certainly throughout what is today modern Turkey, but maybe beyond that John kind of wrote a universal gospel, kind of an addition or a last word in terms of Jesus. And so these four audiences shape the gospels that we have. And each of them also offers different perspectives. So the audiences shape what we see, but also they provide us with various perspectives. Some people say that when a great man dies, or a great woman dies, that the biography of the individual kind of follows three phases. And the first phase is usually people start to recount what they did and all the amazing things that happened. And then the next thing that comes along is people start to look at their letters and speeches, and they kind of consider what they said. And then the third thing that comes along, biography that comes along, is people start to look at who he or she was, what motivated them, what drove them, what was that inner vision, what was that? And people have said that this is really what the Gospels are doing as well. Mark's Gospel is a gospel of action. Now, again, if my theory is right, that has some military connection, okay, the soldiers are not wanting anything boring. Okay, they don't want, we don't want to do anything too deep here. And so John's gospel is like this action-packed gospel. And if you read it in Greek, it uses the word immediately. And it uses it 41 times. So it's like they got into a boat and immediately they were on the other side. And immediately this happened and immediately that happened. And the way the dialogue goes, it goes, he said, she said. It's like fast and furious. And interestingly, we'll see this next week, he slows it down as we move towards the foot of the cross. There's actually a deliberate slowing of the narrative. Very cleverly done by Mark. But it's all action. Then you'll discover as you look at Matthew and Luke, suddenly they introduce all the teaching of Jesus. And you'll discover that there are large chunks of the teaching of Jesus. Matthew's gospel is designed around 5 of the sermons of Jesus. These sermons aren't in Mark. And Mark designed his gospel around these 5 talks. Luke also introduces the talks of Jesus, or the teaching of Jesus. And so Matthew and Luke introduce what he said. And then the fourth element is John. John looks more deeply at who Jesus was. And although he gives us some of his teaching and he gives us some of his actions, for John, the critical thing was to show us who he was and reflect that and let the audience understand this. So how does this kind of play out in terms of these different perspectives and these different audiences in relation to what the Gospels are doing? Well, you'll see if we look at Mark. Mark is speaking possibly to certainly Romans and Gentiles and maybe soldiers, and asking the question, how can this be? How can this man be the Messiah? And what Mark does is he shows that Jesus is God. Some people think Mark doesn't say Jesus is God, but we'll see next week that he definitely does. In fact, I think he makes the most outlandish statements about Jesus being God. We'll see next week. But he said it was a secret. And you'll discover if you read Mark's gospel in the first half, every time Jesus does a miracle or does something amazing, he tells people, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. Keep it secret. And so Mark is saying, do you know what? Jesus was God, but it was a secret. People didn't realize it. It was hidden from them. It was a secret. And it's called the Messianic secret, and it's a theme that runs throughout Mark's gospel. And then what happens as Mark goes on, Jesus starts to say, this is who I am. And the critical point is when Peter recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. He says, you're the Son of God at Caesarea Philippi. And then Jesus says, yes, I am. And he says, what's going to happen is I'm going to go and I'm going to die. in Jerusalem, and on the third day I'm going to rise again. It says it 3 times on the way up to, and they keep saying, no, it can't be. No, it can't be. That cannot be the good news. This cannot be the way it's going to go. And Jesus keeps repeating it and keeps repeating it and keeps repeating it. And then we have the story of Jesus' death. And suddenly the centurion gets it. This is the Son of God. This is God intervening. This is good news. And understanding the story. And Mark wants to communicate that to very skeptical people going, really? And he said, yeah, it's a secret, but if you open your eyes, you'll see the wonder of what was happening. Mark's gospel. You don't need to come back next week. Then Matthew got Mark's gospel, and Matthew wanted to show that this story was the fulfillment of the Old Testament. And so he wrote his gospel to show that Jesus was the second Moses. In Deuteronomy, I think it's 24, there's a prophecy where Moses says, you know what, there's going to be somebody like me that's going to come in the future, and he's going to bring you the law again. And he's going to bring you a new law. And there's this wonderful prophecy in Deuteronomy. And Matthew's saying, that's Jesus. 5 sermons, just like the 5 books of Moses in the Old Testament, 5 sermons. Again, Matthew's probably brought all Jesus' teaching together. They probably weren't delivered as sermons. And he put them out there, so we say, this is the new Moses. This is the fulfillment of what the Old Testament was about. You see, because there were 2 schools of thought. Well, maybe not go into that tonight, right? So that was Matthew. Then Luke is trying to show those radical values that I was talking about, trying to show you how it's an upside-down world. Like Mary's song, the Magnificat. She's saying, thank you, God, that you ignore the oppressors, you ignore all the powerful guys, and you go for the poor and the marginalized. I love the start of it. Luke chapter 3. Ben Hur style music playing, and it says, in the year of Caesar Augustus, when Antipas was ruling in Galilee and Philip was reigning in Judea, and so it goes on. And you could imagine all this music as it mentions all the top back guys, and then it says, and the word of God came to John the Baptist. And you go, who's John the Baptist? We just talked about all the most powerful people in the society. But the word goes to John the Baptist, some weird guy living out in a desert somewhere, wearing weird clothes. I mean, it's the upside-down kingdom. And he wants Theophilus to know this is about revolution, a radical revolution that's happening. And then John was addressing, but John wrote a wee bit later and after the Gospels, and he's writing at a time when people were beginning to struggle with the idea that Jesus was a man. People, we struggle with Jesus being divine, but they struggled with the idea of Jesus being a man, because the divine could never become human. And so some people were saying, well, it was God pretending to be a man, what we call a theophany. He was just pretending. He wasn't really a man. He was just pretending. And then there was this other guy that came along, Cyrannus. And Cyrannus said, well, actually what happened was God just popped into Jesus' body for a wee while and then popped back out. And so he popped in at the baptism and popped out before the crucifixion. And John was like, no! And this was the big threat. And it was other Christians or people that were calling themselves Christians that were saying this stuff. And John goes, I was there. I might be an old guy, but I know I was there. And I want you to understand, Jesus was fully God and fully man. And the two are not to be divided. And that's the message of his gospel. So that's kind of audience and thing that are communicated in relation to them. Who wrote them then? So we have 4 people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Who are they? Who are these folks? Well, John Mark probably wrote the first gospel. John is mentioned for the first time in Acts chapter 12. And his mum had the church in Jerusalem staying or hanging out in her house. So she was obviously a powerful lady. She had a big house. The church was there. When Peter gets out of jail, he goes there. And this is the house of John Mark. That's his mum. Mum probably connected John Mark with Peter. And for a time, we think John Mark toured with Peter. Right? And he heard all the stories of Jesus. A lot of what you have in Mark's gospel is thought to be the preaching of Peter. And one of the things you'll see in Mark's gospel is Peter always comes out looking bad. because I think that's the way Peter preached. He didn't preach as an arrogant guy. He preached as, yeah, I blew it here, I blew it there. He blew it a lot. And John Mark was kind of recording it. John Mark was always a sort of number 2 kind of PA. He then went on to work with his cousin Barnabas, and then he hung out with Paul until they had a bit of a disagreement. Somewhere in the midst of this, I think a community, possibly a Roman centurion, invited Mark to say, write a gospel, write down all those stories that you heard from Peter and the other disciples when you were in Jerusalem and things. And we get our first gospel, Mark's gospel. Then we have Luke. And Luke is a number 2. He supports Paul. He journeys with him. At one point in Acts, it's really interesting. He starts to use we. We traveled. We did this. And people are like, looks like Luke's hanging out with them all. And why are Mark and Luke probably the folks that wrote this? At no point in the Gospels are we actually told that they wrote them. But why do we think? The reason is that if you were making it up, you would go for bigger figures. You would have gone for the Gospel of Peter, or the Gospel of James, or the Gospel of somebody, a big hitter. Oh yeah, we'll make it really good. John, Mark, and Luke are kind of second division in the list of apostles, and yet they're the people attributed with God, which suggests that they're authentic. John the apostle tells us in John chapter 21 that this was the disciple. So it actually makes the claim it's John the apostle that wrote this. Oh, by the way, forgot to mention in Mark, there's a wonderful little story in Mark where there's a little autograph. In Mark 14, remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, there's a little story where this young boy appears in the garden. So we're in the middle of a story of Jesus being arrested, and then suddenly we have this, what's this? A wee boy who's out, and apparently he's just in a linen ephod, which isn't very much. And he gets caught up with the Roman soldiers, or the soldiers, the priestly soldiers. And apparently they grab him, and he ends up losing his linen ephod, and he runs off naked. Right? And we get 2 sentences on this. And you go, what's that doing there? And people think it's a little autograph. John Mark telling his story. Probably his mum, who lived up in the upper city, was saying, Mark, find out what's happening. He got up out of bed, ran down, not many clothes on, ends up getting involved. He records it in his gospel. It's a very interesting little signature in Mark's gospel. John the apostle, we're pretty sure, he makes the claim, and tradition is very, very strong. And then we have Matthew. And the reason probably Matthew is right is because Matthew corrects Mark, but changes Mark. And I'm going to explain how they do that in a moment. And for somebody to change it, they have to probably be a bigger hitter than the individual that they replace for the early church to do that. And so Matthew it would definitely have had to have been one of the apostles. So these 4 are fairly good, and we have no other people that are attributed with these gospels, no evidence that the names are made up. They go right back to the early 2nd century. So I think we can be fairly certain that John, Mark, Luke, John, and Matthew wrote each one of these gospels. However, this brings us to a kind of interesting question for academics about the relationship of the different gospels. You see, I told you that Mark was written first. But Mark wasn't only written first. Mark was copied. We have a system at university, which if you put in an essay, it will tell you how much they've copied from a book. You ever heard that? It's called Turnitin. It's great fun. And it gives you a mark. If we did that with Matthew, it would show that 90% of Mark is in Matthew. That suggests he's done serious copying. If we did it with Luke, it would suggest 50% of Mark is in Luke. And scholars, people spend a lot of time, but what they reckon was that Mark was written first, then Matthew decided to add in the teaching of Jesus into Mark and adapt it for a Jewish audience. And then Luke decided to come along and explain this in a much broader sense to a much wider audience, to the whole Roman world kind of thing. And so Luke, and that's the three. They're not sure if, well, they think that Matthew and Luke had another source called Q. That's what academia says. However, there's another school of thought, and I like this school of thought, that Luke had Matthew and Mark in front of him. He actually had the Gospels, and he copied from them. And he actually tells you that at the start of his Gospel. He tells you the other Gospels have been written. How about the dating of these things? So when were they written? Well, the traditional scholarship, you know how Jesus says, it's been said, and I say this, I'm going to do a little bit of that. We're told that Mark, by this guy called Irenaeus, that Mark wrote after Peter and Paul. The tradition says that Mark was the secretary of Peter and that he recorded what he had heard from Peter. And I think that's kind of accurate. However, Irenaeus says he did it after Peter and Paul died. And so that means it's 67 or thereabouts, because they died under the persecution of Nero. So most scholarship believe that the Gospels came into being as the first generation of Christians began to die out, and they said, we need to get the stories. So they started to write the Gospels. Mark being the first one, then Matthew followed that, Luke followed that, and then John, who was written during the reign of Domitian in 81 to 96. So roughly a period from about 70 to 96. That's what academia will tell you. Okay? However, there is good reason to question a lot of this dating, and I'll just give you a couple of reasons why we should question this dating. The first one, and the principal one. Again, academics don't like this because it means that Jesus prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jesus couldn't have possibly prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem. But he possibly did. And the reason for this is Luke's gospel, right? Luke is written as two parts, Luke, Acts. And can anybody tell me where Acts finishes? Anybody know how it finishes? Paul is arriving in Rome. We know the date, 62 AD. He arrives in Rome in 62 AD, and Luke finishes his story, 62 AD. Now, that's really weird. Why doesn't he include the deaths of Peter and Paul? And scholars will come up with all these big answers and all that, but none of it makes any sense to me. The most logical conclusion is the reason he stopped at 62 was because that's when he was writing it. This is the story, 62 AD. It's not even a good ending, particularly. It's just like, oh, I've run out. That's because we're now up to date. And you read the end of Acts. And if Luke is 62 AD, it pushes these early synoptic gospels, Matthew and Mark, much earlier. And Christian tradition, so apart from Irenaeus, because Irenaeus was out of sorts with all the other tradition, all the other early Christians said that Mark wrote when Peter was alive, and he wrote during the reign of Caligula, which dates it into the early 40s. And that's all the Christians say. And I think that that is a good dating for Mark. So I think Mark could be 40, and I think Luke Acts could be 62, and then John comes along 20-odd years later, just to kind of say, oh, there's all these new ideas developing, and I want to just shut all this down now so we have it. And so we have the three Gospels and we have it. So how did it work? This is how I think it worked, how we got four Gospels. What happened was Mark got requested, I think from Alexandria, not Rome, and Mark went to Alexandria where there were a bunch of Roman soldiers. He got asked to write a gospel. He wrote a gospel for Roman soldiers. That gospel then went to Jerusalem. They then said, hey, we need to adapt this for a Jewish audience and put in the teaching of Jesus. So you got Matthew's gospel. Then Luke came along and said, we need to make it broader. And he probably wrote it in Caesarea, which is on the coast in Israel. And he wrote it for a much wider Gentile audience, explaining the radical nature of Christianity. Because people were saying, what's this Christianity about? Until John came along. At the end of his life, he was probably an old man of 70 and 80, and he said, we need to nail these ideas that are developing in the church. Jesus is God. Very different, distinctive, written for audiences and perspective. But here's the thing. They all tell the same story of a man who appears in Galilee, who makes his way to Jerusalem, who dies on a cross, is risen on the third day, and is declared king, and has now brought a new age. And he wants Roman soldiers to know this. He wants Jews to know this. He wants Gentile skeptics to know this. And he wants the Christians who fill the churches to know this. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Amen.